not merely a professional virtue for a lex mechanic auditor. It is the substance of the function. Without precision, the record becomes opinion. Opinion is not data. Data is not the truth of events, but it is the only truth that can be shared, transmitted, verified, and acted upon. This distinction matters. In the siege apparatus of the Astra Militarum, in the grinding machinery of a compliance campaign that has already consumed 14 months and 400,000 lives in the reclamation of the Vordrast subsector, the distinction between recorded truth and personal truth is the difference between a soldier and a ghost. I was trained to produce records. I was trained to trust them. The examination room at Checkpoint Oris Tertium was not a room in any architectural sense. It was a tent structure reinforced with prefabricated plasteel panels bolted to the forward interior wall of Redoubt 17, which itself occupied a position between the third and fourth parallel trenches of the western siege front. The structure was erected specifically for the rotation examination procedure, which occurred at the close of every 14-day combat cycle when the regiment's forward elements cycled back through the line. Returning soldiers passed through Oris Tertium in groups of 12, were examined, cleared, and returned to the billets behind the redoubt before the next cycle group arrived. The procedure had been conducted without interruption for the preceding 6 months. Confessor Adamus Urel presided. He was a compact man of perhaps 60 years, bald in the manner of deliberate tonsure rather than age, with biometric scanning apparatus fitted over his left eye and a microsuture injector modified for blood sampling built into the casing of his servo skull's primary manipulator arm. The skull floated to his right, rotating slowly on its suspensor field, its eye lenses cycling through illumination spectra. He carried a copy of the Lectitio Divinitatus bound in what appeared to be synthetic vellum, worn at the corners from genuine use. This was not the copy he read from during examinations. The reading copy was standard issue, embossed with the regimental crest, and was kept on the examination table. The personal copy was never set down. I occupied the secondary position, standing to his left with my data slate mounted on a wrist cradle and my notation armature connected to the base unit at the table's far end. My function was parallel and complementary. The confessor administered the catechism and recorded spiritual compliance. I recorded biometric outputs, neural latency readings from the forehead-mounted sensor pads the soldiers wore during examination, and any notations the confessor requested be appended to the spiritual record. Officially, we maintained separate streams. In practice, the streams were cross-referenced at the end of each session and compared against baseline profiles developed during the soldiers' intake processing. Deviation in either stream triggered secondary examination. In 6 months, secondary examination had been triggered 17 times. 12 resulted in immediate detention and transfer to Ordo Hereticus holding facilities. 4 were resolved through Medicae evaluation as psychological trauma responses consistent with prolonged bombardment exposure. 1 had been administrative error on my part, a miskeyed biometric identifier that flagged a veteran sergeant's neural profile against a deceased private's baseline. I had noted this error in my own record. I had flagged it. I had been informed that such errors, while procedurally regrettable, were statistically negligible. That notation existed in my personal log. I thought of it sometimes when I stood at the table. It was the 27th day of the third siege phase when the group I will describe arrived for their rotation examination. They came through the entrance flap in standard order, 12 soldiers drawn from 3 different forward platoons, identifiable by shoulder marking as elements of the 14th Vordrast Shock Infantry, a regiment conscripted from the hive laborers of Vordrast Primus and trained primarily in assault breach tactics. They were dressed in field-worn carapace armor, most of it repaired with mismatched plating. Their faces were pale from 14 days below the trench lid, pale in the way specific to the absence of natural light rather than illness or bloodlessness. Their eyes moved normally, tracking myself and the confessor and the servo skull with the habitual threat assessment reflex of soldiers in any new enclosed space. They stood in a line without instruction. They had done this before. The first subject was Trooper Castle Ferren, registered number 8 Vordrast 00441, age 26, third rotation, meaning this was his third appearance at an examination of this type. He had passed both previous examinations without issue. His baseline profile showed slightly elevated anxiety responses, common in hive-born conscripts during enclosed procedures, and a latency spike during the third catechism question, which the confessor had recorded as appropriate doctrinal hesitation rather than deviation. The note was in his file. I had read it before he entered. He sat in the examination chair. He fitted the sensor pad to his forehead without prompting. He held out his forearm for the blood sampling with the particular resigned stillness of a man who has become accustomed to medical procedures he does not enjoy. He looked at the wall behind Confessor Yrel, not at either of us, not at the servo skull. This was normal. The confessor began the catechism. The catechism used at Oris Tertium examination was the standard Lectitio Divinitatis abbreviated assessment, 17 questions of progressive doctrinal specificity. Questions 1 through 5 tested general faith architecture, the Emperor's nature, his sacrifice, his continued governance of humanity through the Golden Throne. 6 through 11 tested personal faith expression, the nature of prayer, the obligation of service, the virtue of death in his name. 12 through 17 tested regiment-specific indoctrination, knowledge of the mission's sacred purpose, the heresy of the Vordrast secessionists, the particular obligations of a soldier of the Astra Militarum during a compliance action. The correct answers were known. They were printed in a column on the assessment sheet. The confessor did not read from the sheet. He had administered this catechism more times than I had administered biometric exams. He knew it as men know the words of litanies recited since childhood, which is to say he knew it past the point of thought. Trooper Ferren answered. Questions 1 through 5 were answered correctly. Questions 6 through 11 were answered correctly. Questions 12 through 17 were answered correctly. The confessor made his marks. He turned to me, and I gave him the biometric summary. Neural latency within acceptable range, blood chemistry normal, no mutation markers in the sample. Cortisol levels consistent with moderate stress response, lower than average for rotation return subjects, but not anomalously so. Soldiers with higher rotation numbers tended to habituate to the examination. I began to notate the summary as clean and move to the next entry field. And then I did not. I do not know what stopped me, precisely. It was not an alarm, it was not a reading that exceeded a threshold. The confessor had already moved to record Ferren as pure and was gesturing for him to stand. The servo skull had already updated its witness log. The form was already 3/4 complete. What I noticed was a sound, or more accurately, the absence of a sound. Trooper Ferren had answered every question correctly, and he had answered them at the correct speed, and his voice had been appropriately modulated, carrying the gravity that the catechism requires. None of this was irregular. What I noticed was the interval between the end of each question and the beginning of each answer. In standard examination, this interval exists because thought exists. A soldier hears a question. The question activates memory. Memory connects to belief. Belief generates a response. The response is spoken. In the soldiers I had examined over 6 months, this interval was variable. The devout answered faster on doctrinal questions, slower on personal expression questions. The uncertain reversed this. The traumatized showed irregular patterns. The dying showed almost none. Ferren's interval was uniform. Each question had been followed by a pause of identical duration. Not the duration of processing, the duration of a mechanism awaiting a trigger. It was very short. It was within the bounds I would have marked as acceptable. But it was the same. Question 1. Question 7. Question 15. The same interval, measured not by instrument but by the particular sensitivity a person develops when they listen to voices all day, every day, in a structured environment. I could not quantify it. I could not present it as a reading. I could not enter it into the data stream. Ferren stood, accepted his clearance mark from the confessor, and walked to the exit without looking at either of us. I wrote, in the notation field reserved for additional observations, minor irregularity, response timing pattern, possible habituation artifact. I marked it as non-actionable. I did not know what else to mark it as. The confessor glanced at the notation when I transferred the file. He raised his eyes to me briefly, then returned his attention to the next subject. He said nothing. The second subject was Trooper Mikhail Orveth. The third was Corporal Sene Dror. The fourth was Trooper Ansel Weiss. Each of them answered every question correctly. Each of them displayed the same uniform interval. I wrote the same notation for each one. I marked each as non-actionable. The confessor continued his work without comment. The servo skull continued its witness log. The examinations continued. Before the shift ended, I had processed 4 subjects with the notation. 8 others had passed without it. The forms for all 12 were transmitted to regimental records by the time I sealed my data slate for the evening. Outside Aris Tertium, the artillery had begun its night cycle. The ground moved in long rolling compressions, each one registering as vibration through the plasteel floor panels before the sound arrived. The tent canvas breathed with each pressure wave. A phosphor lantern in the corner of the room swayed on its hook, pushing light across the examination table in slow, repeating arcs. I sat with my notation armature disconnected and my personal log open, and I wrote, because the personal log is the one record that has no required form, that I had noticed something I could not classify. I wrote that this was probably a mistake on my part. I wrote that the confessor had noted nothing. I wrote that the system had not flagged anything. Then I closed the log and went to the billet. I did not sleep particularly well, but this was not unusual in the trenches. The regime of my duties in the week following was ordered by function rather than investigation. I was not authorized to investigate. My function was documentation. I appeared at Aris Tertium for each scheduled examination. I performed my portion of the assessment, I recorded the outputs, and I transferred the completed forms. If the confessor made no note of anomaly, my note of anomaly was a secondary observation and was treated accordingly. I understood this. The doctrine of imperial detection is not merely operational procedure, it is theological. The Lex Mechanicus Codex, which I had studied during my initial training at the Administratum Scholae on Vordrast Secundus, contains a section on the relationship between measurement and truth that I had memorized as an exercise in doctrinal exactitude. The central statement of the section reads, in approximation, the instrument does not define the phenomenon. The phenomenon is defined by its categorization within the authorized schema of the institution. The instrument measures. The institution classifies. The classification determines response. No instrument may substitute for institutional judgment, as no instrument possesses the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of doctrinal development. I had believed this statement completely when I memorized it. I had continued to believe it through my training, through my posting to the Vordrast campaign, through 6 months of examination work at Aris Tertium. It was one of the structural beliefs of my function. Without it, the function has no grounding. Without it, my notation is opinion, and my opinion is irrelevant to the operation of anything. The confessor had marked all 4 subjects as pure. Purity is what the system declares. I reviewed the 4 anomalous notations in my data slate the following morning, before the day's first examination group arrived. The notations were visible in my personal record. They were visible in the transmitted forms. In the additional observations field, they were, in the technical sense, part of the record, but they were marked non-actionable. In the data streams of the regimental processing apparatus, non-actionable notations exist in a secondary index that is not consulted during standard operations. They are not deleted, they do not disappear, but they are not used. They are the record of things noticed that were not worth noticing, preserved because preservation is absolute and deletion requires specific sanction, but otherwise invisible to any routine query. I was aware of all of this. I revised my interpretation of my own observation. The uniform response intervals I had noticed were, on reflection, likely the product of extended rotation stress producing a dissociative coping mechanism. Subjects under prolonged bombardment sometimes developed behavioral regularization as a stress response, a kind of self-imposed predictability that the mind constructs to manage the unpredictability of their environment. This had a designation in the Medicae literature. I did not know the specific term, but the phenomenon was documented. The confessor's authority reinforced this conclusion. He was experienced. He was trained to detect spiritual deviation. He had not detected it. I was trained to detect biometric deviation. I had detected none, technically. I had detected a subjective impression. Subjective impressions are not data. I accepted this. I felt, after accepting it, a quality of relief that I examined briefly and then set aside. It felt very much like the relief a person experiences when a frightening noise resolves into a mundane explanation. I noted this in the personal log, then deleted the note because the personal log was beginning to feel like a conversation I was having with myself about something I had decided was not important, which is not a productive use of notation capacity. The day's first examination group arrived. I performed my function. On the third day after the anomalous examination, I was summoned to the command section's administrative block, which occupied the two middle tents of Redoubt 17's command cluster. The summons was issued by Regimental Liaison Scribe Pelhan Droz, a mid-rank administratum functionary who coordinated between the regiment's command staff and the various attached specialist personnel. I had dealt with Droz regularly. He was meticulous in the manner of a man who uses procedure to avoid thinking, which is its own form of precision. He informed me that I was to conduct field verification assessment in the forward trench network. Specifically, sections 9 through 14 of the second parallel, where reports had been submitted by forward officers noting unusual composure among returned soldiers. The reports had been routed from company-level officers to the battalion command, from there to regimental command, and had arrived on Droz's desk flagged as requiring documentation of behavioral assessment. The specific instruction was written on the assignment form in the language that instructions always use, which is precise about scope and entirely silent about implication. The form read, "Document behavioral parameters of forward elements in designated sections, record against standard composure and discipline indices. Note deviations above or below established tolerances. Submit completed assessment within 48 hours of initial observation period. Below tolerances." The form included a note that I was to approach the assessment as a documentation exercise and was not to discuss findings with forward officers before the 48-hour submission period had elapsed. Droz gave me a travel authorization and an escort to the forward sections. The forward trench sections designated in the assignment were approximately 400 meters ahead of the command redoubt, requiring transit through the communication trenches, which were cut perpendicular to the main line and served as arterial passages between the rear areas and the firing steps. The communication trenches were narrow, their walls cut from the pale clay and ash substrate of the Vordrast surface, and they were covered above with corrugated metal sheeting that collected the sound of distant artillery and turned it into something felt in the chest and spine rather than heard by the ears. The ground underfoot was boards laid over the accumulated base of 6 months of mud and construction material and the slow accumulation of everything an army leaves behind when it occupies a position for long enough. My escort was a corporal from the regimental provost detail, whose name I did not ask for and who did not offer it. He moved through the communication trench with the particular efficiency of a person who has made this transit many times and has reduced it to a physical problem entirely separate from his thoughts. He did not speak. I matched his pace. The noise increased as we moved forward. Artillery is not one sound. It is a register of sounds that overlap and compound and produce, at their combined effect, a pressure rather than a volume. The shells falling at distance are low and felt. The shells impacting in the near field are sharp and felt differently, a concussive quality that affects the teeth and the membrane behind the sternum. In the forward sections, The near-field impacts were constant enough that the intervals between them became indistinguishable from the impacts themselves. The world was impact. The absence of impact was a variant of impact. Section 10 was the first occupied section I reached. The soldiers I observed there were arranged along the firing step in standard defensive formation, approximately 2 meters apart, their weapons shouldered or rested against the forward wall. They were wearing the same equipment as the examination subjects from 4 days prior. Many had the same regimental identifier on their shoulder plates. Some were the same men. I recognized Trooper Ferren's profile from behind before I checked his number on my data slate's assignment manifest. He was standing at the firing step, looking out through the periscope aperture built into the parapet. His posture was correct. His equipment was properly secured. His weapon was at rest but accessible. He was, to the observational parameters of the standard composure index, performing his duty correctly. I watched him for approximately 3 minutes before understanding what I was looking at. During those 3 minutes, 4 artillery shells impacted within a range I estimated at between 50 and 80 meters from his position. The nearest impact threw mud and debris over the top of the parapet in a shower that fell across the fire step and across his right shoulder. The sound was sufficient to produce temporary auditory saturation, even through the dampening apparatus in my auditor's headset. The concussive pressure was enough that I braced my hand against the rear wall of the trench. Ferren did not move. Not in the way that experienced soldiers learn not to move, the disciplined stillness of veterans who have habituated to near-miss impacts. That stillness is never complete. It involves compensatory micro-movements, weight shifts, involuntary tension responses that are visible as changes in the shoulder posture or the grip on a weapon. Experienced soldiers are still because they have learned to be still. The muscle effort of remaining still is visible. Ferren was still the way an object is still. I watched 3 other soldiers in the same section during the same period. One was standing, one was crouched against the trench wall making what appeared to be a minor equipment repair, one was eating from a field ration packet. All 3 were exposed to the same impacts. All 3 exhibited the same quality of stillness. When a voice from the section's vox post issued a brief all-clear confirmation, all 3 men immediately resumed or initiated activity, moving with fluid precision to their next task. No decompression, no exhalation, no exchanged look or spoken word. I wrote down what I saw. I used the language of the composure index. I recorded minimal fear response indicators, efficient execution of position maintenance, sustained situational awareness under bombardment conditions. All of these statements were accurate. None of them described what I was actually observing. I moved through sections 10 through 14 over the following 6 hours, taking notes in each. By the time I reached section 14, I had stopped trying to reconcile what I was writing with what I was seeing. The men in section 14 were performing a forward perimeter check, moving along the outer lip of the trench in pairs, checking the wire emplacements and sensor posts. This was a task that required brief exposure above the parapet, which under current conditions involved intermittent exposure to suppression fire from the secessionist positions approximately 300 meters ahead. This was dangerous work. The soldiers were performing it as if it were not dangerous, which is to say they were performing it without the behavioral indicators of danger awareness that I had come to understand from my time in examination work. As a normal component of a soldier's biometric and behavioral profile, the completed records show soldiers in all sections performing their duties within approved parameters. I did not add supplementary notations. I had not been instructed to add supplementary notations. I submitted the assessment within the 48-hour window and returned to examination duties at Aris Tertium. Confessor Urel acknowledged my return with a nod. The examination table was already set up. The day's first group was already forming outside. I took my position at the secondary station. We began. The Medicae ward attached to Redoubt 17 occupied a separate structure behind the main command cluster. a larger prefabricated unit with actual internal walls and a heating system that produced warmth in the inconsistent way of heating systems under sustained field use, functioning well in some sections and not at all in others. It served the rear elements of the 3-battalion complex that rotated through Redoubt 17, which meant it processed a continuous flow of casualties from the active rotation as well as the returning rotation casualties who required treatment beyond field Medicae capacity. I was directed to the Medicae ward on the 12th day after the field verification assessment under an assignment that identified itself as standard biometric baseline verification for treatment subjects. This was a real task, part of the ongoing administrative maintenance of soldier records, and one that I had performed twice before at other points in the campaign. I did not question the assignment. Senior Medicae Officer Thien Rast met me at the ward entrance. She was a severe woman of middle years who wore her functions uniform with a tidiness that spoke less of vanity than of the particular discipline of someone who imposes order on her appearance because everything else in her daily environment is beyond order. She showed me to the sections I would be working in and gave me the access codes I needed for the individual treatment records. The ward was divided into 3 sections. The first section held ambulatory patients, the second held recumbent patients under active treatment, and the third held critical care patients. I was assigned the second and third sections for my baseline verification work. I began in the second section. The patients in the second section were soldiers undergoing treatment for the range of injuries common to a siege environment: shrapnel wounds, blast injuries, exposure-related conditions. Some post-operative patients recovering from surgical procedures performed in the forward Medicae stations before transfer here. The section was occupied by approximately 30 patients at any given time. I moved through them, taking the standard biometric readings, cross-referencing against intake profiles, noting any significant deviations for Medical Officer Rast's review. This was routine. I had done this before. The process involved a brief wrist scanner contact, a retinal check, and a short verbal confirmation from the patient. Most patients were cooperative, if not enthusiastic. The discomfort of their condition made them generally quiet and somewhat isolated within themselves, but they were present. The first subject I processed, who had been transferred from the forward sections after the period I had observed, was a soldier named Trooper Kerev Mast from Section 11. He was listed as undergoing treatment for a penetrating wound to the right side, received 4 days prior during a perimeter check operation. The wound had required surgical repair. He was on the recumbent track, connected to an intravenous administration system and listed as in the early recovery phase. I introduced myself and began the baseline check. Trooper Mast looked at me. His eyes tracked me as I approached. He acknowledged my introduction with a brief movement of his head. When I pressed the wrist scanner to his forearm for the biometric reading, the scanner indicated contact normally. His biometric data transferred. The readings aligned with his baseline profile within acceptable deviation for a patient in post-surgical recovery. Then the Medicae orderly came to change the wound packing. The wound to Mast's right side was located approximately at the midpoint of the flank, and the packing change required the orderly to remove the existing material, which had adhered, and to place the fresh packing, which required pressure. This process is painful. I knew it was painful because I had observed wound packing changes before and I was aware of their mechanical requirements. The orderly confirmed the procedure to Mast before beginning. Mast did not change his expression. The orderly worked for approximately 4 minutes. Mast's vitals on the bedside monitor showed no meaningful variation. His heart rate did not elevate. His skin conductance, which I was watching on the biometric feed from the wrist scanner I had not yet removed, showed no spike. His breathing remained at the same rate it had been before the procedure began. He did not flinch. He did not clench. He did not make a sound. The orderly finished. He addressed Mast briefly, something routine about the next packing change. Mast nodded again with the same brief movement. I stood with the wrist scanner still loosely against Mast's forearm, and I did not write anything for a moment. Then I wrote down his vitals, marked the baseline as confirmed, and moved to the next patient. Over the following 3 hours, I processed 11 patients who had come from the forward sections in the period corresponding to my observation assignment. Of those 11, 7 displayed the same absence of pain response during treatment procedures. 2 of those 7 were undergoing active procedures at the time of my assessment. Neither showed physiological indicators of pain. 3 of the 11 were in the critical care section, transferred there not from acute injury deterioration but from what Officer Rast had logged as undetermined cessation events. Soldiers who had been in stable recovery, who had simply stopped maintaining their own vital braces, function during the course of a treatment session. Their bodies had ceased without crisis, without the physiological signatures of distress or system failure. They had simply become unavailable. Their final recorded statements, delivered to the attending Medicae personnel before cessation, were logged in the treatment records as prayers. Structurally complete prayers, containing all required elements of form, delivered at conversational volume without change in inflection or urgency. I read these logs sitting at the ward's administrative station with Officer Rast's permission after I had completed my biometric circuit. The logs were transcribed by the attending Medicae personnel from memory. The transcriptions agreed closely enough to represent the same event observed by different recorders, which is to say that the variation between them was the variation of accurate memory, not fabrication. The prayers were correct. Every word was correct. The structure was correct. The theological framing was correct. The soldiers had died, in the middle of treatment, saying exactly the right words in exactly the right way, without fear, without the particular quality of desperate sincerity that distinguishes a prayer uttered by someone who believes from a prayer uttered by someone performing belief. I submitted my baseline verification report to Officer Rast and returned to Oris Tertium. I did not put the observations about pain response or final statements into the official report. The official report was a baseline verification. It did not have a field for these things. I put them in my personal log instead, where they joined the other accumulating things that had no field. The personal log was getting long. The Vox echo phenomenon began approximately 3 weeks into the period I am describing, and it is worth being specific about when I first noticed it because the noticing was gradual rather than sudden, and the gradual quality of the noticing is part of its significance. The VoxNet in Redoubt 17 was a standard Astra Militarum regimental communications system, a distributed network of Vox terminals at company and battalion level, connected to a central routing unit in the command cluster and linked upward to divisional command via a long-range relay. I had access to a monitoring terminal in the examination block, which I used primarily to receive assignment updates and to verify transmission routing of the examination reports I submitted. The terminal was not sophisticated. It displayed text outputs from routed transmissions and had a live audio feed for command-level frequencies. I had become accustomed to the particular sound texture of the VoxNet as a feature of my working environment. The characteristic distortions of field communications, the atmospheric interference generated by the artillery and its effect on Vox transmission quality, the specific timbre of the different officers whose voices I heard regularly enough to recognize without identification headers. I knew this sound the way one knows any persistent environmental feature, with the specific inattentive awareness of something always present. The echoes were not, at first, audible as echoes. The first time I noticed was during a transmission from Sergeant Major Olka Brund, whose voice I knew well from 6 months of transmission monitoring. She was relaying a casualty count from Section 9. The transmission was routine. I was not paying close attention. I was updating the examination scheduling matrix while the transmission played through the audio feed. Brund finished the casualty count. There was the standard end of transmission tone. And then, approximately 2 seconds later, a fragment of the transmission repeated. It was not the casualty count. It was a 3-word phrase from the middle of the transmission. something procedural about transfer coordination. The repetition lasted less than a second. The tonal quality was very slightly different, not the difference of a different speaker, but the difference of the same phrase in a different register, lower, slower by a nearly unmeasurable degree. I looked at the terminal. The transmission log showed the transmission as ended. The live feed showed no active channel. I noted it in my personal log as a possible artifact of the atmospheric interference conditions, which were documented as affecting transmission quality during high-intensity bombardment periods. I did not note it in any official record because there was no official record for this type of observation. Over the following 10 days, I heard the echo phenomenon 6 additional times. Each time it followed a routine transmission. Each time it was a fragment, never the complete transmission, never longer than a few seconds. Each time the fragment was a phrase with a liturgical structure, an affirmation, a confirmation, a piece of doctrine embedded in operational language. In the Astra Militarum, operational language is saturated with liturgy. They are not distinguishable once learned. The prayers are also orders. The orders are also prayers. The echoes always selected the liturgical component. I raised the issue once with Vox Operator Second Class Morant, a technically competent young man who managed the communications terminal and was therefore the appropriate person to report a potential interference anomaly. Morant listened to my description. He ran a diagnostic on the terminal. He showed me the atmospheric interference logs for the relevant periods. The interference logs showed elevated atmospheric disturbance correlating with the bombardment intensity. This was expected. Morant explained that complex standing wave interactions between the bombardment concussions and the terrain features of the trench network could produce exactly the kind of secondary signal reflection I was describing. He was knowledgeable and precise in his explanation. The explanation was technically coherent. He submitted a maintenance request for terminal calibration and told me the echoes should diminish after the next maintenance cycle. They did not diminish. Command reclassified the phenomenon as environmental artifact in a brief technical notice circulated to all Vox operators in the Redoubt network. No further action was indicated. I continued to hear the echoes. I began to hear them not only through the Vox terminal, but in the examination room itself, in a different way. When groups of soldiers moved through the catechism examination and their voices filled the space, I began to notice a quality in the collective sound of multiple voices answering the same question that was not present in any individual voice, a faint reverberation that did not belong to the acoustics of the tent structure, not a mechanical echo, something that happened in the space between multiple identical utterances. I did not write this down anywhere. There is no notation system for what happens to sound in a space that the sound no longer inhabits sincerely. On the 41st day of this period, which was a night cycle maintenance shift during the 7th week of the 3rd siege phase, something happened that I cannot explain within the existing parameters of any record I have access to. The night cycle bombardment is the heavier of the two primary fire schedules, conducted by the siege artillery batteries positioned approximately 2 kilometers behind the redoubt line. It is scheduled on a predictable cycle, commencement at 22 standard hours, peak intensity between midnight and approximately 3, diminishing concentration through the pre-dawn period. This schedule is known to all elements in the siege apparatus. Forward elements use the predictable pause periods within the cycle for resupply runs, casualty evacuation, and equipment maintenance. The schedule is published in the regimental operations log. Everyone knows it. I was working a late notation shift, completing the backlog of examination records from the previous day's cycle, when the alert from the command Vox post indicated that forward observation was reporting movement in the open ground between sections 8 and 11. This was not unusual. Movement in the forward zone during night bombardment cycles occurred regularly, both from our forces and from secessionist elements. I monitored the Vox traffic as background to my notation work. What occurred over the following 20 minutes was this. 3 platoons from the 2nd rotation elements, stationed in sections 9, 10, and 11, and designated as the Night Cycle Ready Reserve, advanced across open ground into the active bombardment zone. They did not advance under cover of the pause periods. They advanced during active bombardment. Their movement was precise and coordinated across all 3 sections simultaneously. The bombardment was active. The advance was total. The casualties were total. The Vox traffic during this period is in the official record. I have reviewed it. The relevant sequence begins with a company-level officer noting the movement, then a series of escalating queries about authorization, then a silence, then the post-event reports. The authorization for the advance was logged in the command records as having been issued at 22 minutes past midnight. The movement began at 20 minutes past midnight, 2 minutes before the order. I reviewed this discrepancy in the command log the following day when I had access to the chronological transmission records as part of my administrative duties. The discrepancy was visible. The timestamps were machine-logged, not human-recorded, and machine logs are the most resistant form of record to interpretation error. A post-event notation in the official record stated that the authorization timestamp discrepancy was attributable to Vox routing latency. This is a real phenomenon. Vox routing through the Redoubt 17 system did show latency under peak bombardment conditions, measured at between 15 seconds and 1 minute depending on atmospheric conditions. 2 minutes is at the outer bound of documented latency. But the advance had been precise, coordinated, total. 3 platoons, across 3 sections, moving as a single timed unit. This level of coordination requires communication. Real-time communication, arriving simultaneously, at the correct moment, to initiate movement across a physical distance that would have taken some of those platoons approximately 4 minutes to traverse in order to reach their starting positions at the moment of movement. I wrote a deviation report. I categorized it under the closest available designation, non-quantifiable behavioral drift, a category that existed in the deviation reporting schema as a residual classification for anomalies that did not fit primary categories. I submitted it through standard channels. The writing of the deviation report was an act that I performed in the full awareness that I was performing it against the general direction of my preceding weeks of deliberate epistemic restraint. I had spent those weeks revising my own observations downward, accepting available explanations, declining to escalate incomplete conclusions. This was correct procedure. This was what the doctrine and the structure of my function required of me. But the timestamps were machine-logged. I submitted the report. The response arrived within 4 hours, which was faster than standard deviation report processing by a significant margin. A liaison from the Ordo Hereticus attached to the divisional oversight element arrived at the examination block at the start of the following shift. She identified herself as Interrogator Scribe Velha On. She was young for the rank, carrying herself with the particular composed precision of someone trained to be unreadable. She had a data slate of her own and had clearly already read my submitted report before she arrived. She did not ask me about the platoon advance. She asked me about my records. She asked me specifically about the language I had used in the non-quantifiable behavioral drift categorization, about the notations I had made in the additional observations fields of the examination forms over the preceding weeks, about the field verification assessment I had submitted after my time in the forward sections, and about several other pieces of documentation I had produced and submitted through official channels. The questions were precise, and they were formulated in the particular way of questions that are not seeking information but are confirming that the information already obtained aligns with the information the questioner believes she has. She was reviewing my records for inconsistency. She was reviewing my language for doctrinal deviation. This is the procedure for a report that originates from a source that may itself be unreliable. I was aware of this procedure. It was documented in the Lex Mechanics operational supplement, which I had also memorized. A report submitted by a functionary whose own observational reliability is in question is subject to source review before the report's content is actioned. The source review examines whether the functionary's documented behavior shows patterns of perceptual deviation, doctrinal misalignment, or procedural irregularity that might explain the content of the report as product of error rather than event. The review of my records was methodical and lasted approximately 3 hours. At the end of the 3 hours, interrogator Scribe-On told me, in the precise and neutral language of someone who means exactly what she says and intends for nothing to be added to it, that my deviation report had been received and categorized. She told me that I would be reassigned to internal audit of my own submitted documentation for the preceding 8 weeks, during which time I would not be performing examination duties. She told me that during the internal audit period, I should expect further queries. She told me that the subjects I had noted anomalies on in the examination forms had been removed from active duty for optimization reassignment. She did not tell me where they had been assigned. She left. I sat with my data slate and the still open deviation report, and I understood, in the particular way that one understands things that arrive completely rather than gradually, that the investigation I was now subject to was the response to my report, and that the response was not an investigation of the anomaly I had reported. I thought about the timestamps. The machine logged timestamps with their 2-minute discrepancy. I thought about writing another report. I did not write another report. The internal audit period was 8 days, during which I sat at the examination block with access to my own submitted documentation and a secondary terminal that tracked the ongoing official review of those documents. The review was conducted by 2 administratum audit functionaries I had not previously encountered, working through the same material I was reviewing, and the convergence of these 2 parallel reviews was meant to produce either a confirmation of my record's accuracy or an identification of discrepancies that required explanation. The audit functionaries were efficient. They did not speak with me beyond procedural courtesies. They worked through the documentation with the systematic thoroughness of people performing a task they understand completely and feel no uncertainty about. On the 3rd day of the audit period, a revised notation was entered into my previously submitted examination forms by the official review process. The notation read, "Response interval patterns within acceptable parameters for high rotation examination subjects." Previous notation revised from non-actionable variants to confirmed within baseline. The original notation did not disappear. It was marked as superseded. I sat with this for the remainder of the day. On the 4th day, the Vox Echo phenomena were formally reclassified in the regimental communications log as environmental artifacts attributable to atmospheric interference, consistent with Vox operator Marant's initial assessment. The classification included a technical appendix and was circulated to all communication-adjacent personnel for their records. On the 5th day, the 3 posthumous mission logs for the platoon advance were updated to record the advance as a pre-authorized initiative action, citing the doctrine of forward judgment under the relevant operational supplement that permits unit commanders to initiate movement under time-critical conditions without explicit authorization delay. The timestamp discrepancy was notated as Vox routing latency. The advance was classified as an act of exceptional devotion in the face of enemy positioning. The soldiers who had died were recorded as having died in exemplary service. On the 6th day, one of the audit functionaries asked me to confirm whether I still maintained the interpretive position expressed in my deviation report. The question was asked with the specific quality of a question that has a correct answer. I said that, on review of the official record revisions, I recognized that my initial interpretations had been made without full access to the relevant authorization and technical documentation, and that the revisions accurately reflected the factual status of the events. The functionary made a mark on his data slate. He thanked me. On the 7th day, I was informed that the internal audit had been completed satisfactorily and that I would be returning to examination duties the following morning. On the 7th day, in the evening, in the billet, I opened my personal log and I wrote for the last time in that period what I actually believed. I wrote that the anomalies were real. I wrote that the system had not failed to detect them because the detection protocols were inadequate. The system had encountered the anomalies and had processed them and had absorbed them and had reclassified them as variants of correctness. The system had not been fooled. The system had produced the correct outputs, given the inputs it was designed to process. Everything that had happened fit within the available categories if you bent the categories slightly, if you allowed the definitions to expand in one place and contract in another, if you accepted that precision in language was a different thing from precision in observation. I wrote that I had participated in this. I had revised my own notation when the review process indicated it should be revised. I had confirmed, when asked, that the revision was correct. I had been entirely compliant with every step of the process. I had enabled the system's continuation by performing my role within it. Then I wrote what I had not yet put into language, that I recognized myself in the progression I had been documenting, that the quality I had measured in the soldiers, the increasing absence of interval between stimulus and response, the smoothing of the gap where internal process used to occur, was something I could feel at the edges of my own behavior. I had noticed the anomalies. I had noted them. I had hesitated to escalate them. I had accepted revisions of my own perception. I had conformed my stated beliefs to the system's outputs at each point of pressure. I had not been afraid while I did these things. That was the fact I found most difficult to write. I had not been afraid. I had been reasonable. I had been procedural. I had found available explanations compelling because they were available and because they were offered by authorities whose authority I accepted. The absence of fear had made everything smooth. I sat with the personal log for a long time. Then I wrote one more thing, that I had to decide before the morning whether this recognition changed anything. I wrote, "The system does not reject them because they do not violate doctrine. They fulfill it with increasing perfection. The corruption persists because it aligns with every measurable expectation of purity." I stared at what I had written. Then I wrote, "I am still choosing to write this. The act of choosing is present. As long as it remains, I am still distinct from what I have observed." I closed the log and lay on the billet board and did not sleep. The corruption I had observed did not announce itself. This was the fundamental quality that distinguished it from every form of corruption I had been trained to detect. The category of corruption in the Lex Mechanics operational training and in the Ministorum doctrine that underlies the examination protocols is defined by presence. The presence of mutation, the presence of heretical speech, the presence of forbidden ritual, the presence of visible evidence that something has been added to or grafted onto the structure of a sanctioned human being. Detection works by identifying what should not be there. What I had observed over the preceding weeks had no presence to identify. The soldiers in the trenches were not different. They were performing their functions correctly. Their biometrics were within baseline. Their doctrine was intact. Their obedience was exemplary. In every measurable dimension, they were soldiers of the Astra Militarum, performing their designated function in a combat environment. What was absent was not measurable. What was absent was the interior process that preceded the function, the consideration, the choice, even the automatic choice of a soldier so deeply trained that his obedience is reflexive, still holds within it the ghost of its own possibility. The reflexive choice still began as a person receiving a stimulus and responding to it through the accumulated medium of training and belief and temperament. The response was automatic, but the path it traveled was personal. What I had observed was the path being removed, the response persisting without the path, doctrine being enacted without the enactor. I had no language for this that fit within the approved schema. I had looked for the language. During the 8 days of the audit period, when I had access to a secondary terminal and the official review material, I had also accessed the Regimental Medicae database and the Regimental Ministorum Index, and I had searched both for documentation of phenomena resembling what I had observed. The Medicae database had materials on dissociative conditions, on psychological numbing, on the neurological sequelae of blast exposure. None of these described what I had observed, which was not the damage of function but its accelerating perfection. The Ministorum Index had materials on heretical practice and its physical and spiritual manifestations. The entries were comprehensive and well-maintained: mutation, summoning, pact markings, ritual contamination, psychic emergence, demonic possession. Each of these had defined characteristics, defined detection methods, defined responses. Demonic possession, in the Ministorum documentation, was described as characterized by the presence of an external will operating the human body in opposition to its natural function and against the evidence of the person's prior behavior and belief. The signs were violence, contradiction, violation of doctrine, often accompanied by physical symptoms. What I had observed was the opposite. Not external will in opposition to human function. Something that removed the necessity for will at all, leaving the function intact, perfected, emptied. I considered whether I was looking at the early stages of something the doctrine did not have a name for. I considered whether the doctrine's silence on this point was a gap in knowledge or a gap introduced by the same process I had observed, working at a higher level of the institutional structure over a much longer period. I considered these things, and then I stopped considering them because there was no procedural response available for either conclusion, and because the act of sitting in a billet reasoning about the nature of corruption in the doctrinal apparatus of the Imperium was precisely the kind of reasoning that, if performed visibly, would result in a second review that I would not survive in the same form as the first. I needed to think about what I was going to do. The available options were limited. I could return to examination duties and continue to record nothing that could not be recorded. I could function within my assigned role with the full awareness of what I had observed and the full acceptance that my observations could not be acted upon within the existing system. This was not an acceptable outcome, but it was an available one. I could attempt a different escalation path. The Ordo Hereticus had already received my report and had used it to initiate a source review rather than a content investigation. But the Ordo Hereticus was one pathway. The Adeptus Mechanicus had jurisdiction over some aspects of cognitive function anomaly. The Astra Telepathica had monitoring responsibilities that could intersect with what I had observed if the phenomenon had any psychic component. I did not know if it had a psychic component. I had no psychic detection capability. I had biometric instrumentation and catechism assessment protocols. I could go up the chain of command. I could write a report so specific and so well documented that it could not be absorbed by the normal revision process. I could include the machine-logged timestamps, the specific biometric sequences, the treatment record notations from Officer Rast's ward that I had memorized during my review period. This was the option I was most inclined toward. I held it carefully and examined it from the direction of its likely result. Interrogator Scribe-On had come to review my records within 4 hours of my submission. She had come specifically. She had read the report before she arrived. The apparatus had responded to my deviation report with a targeted source review faster than standard processing time allowed for. This indicated either that the apparatus was monitoring my reports specifically, which was possible given my 8 weeks of supplementary notations, or that the apparatus was monitoring all deviation reports in this category with elevated priority. Either explanation indicated that a more detailed and better documented report would receive the same response, faster and with less patience for my continued function in my current role. There was a third option. It was not available in the sense of being sanctioned, recommended, or survivable. It was available only in the sense that it could be physically performed. I could take the personal log and walk out of Redoubt 17 and find someone with the authority and the distance from this apparatus to receive what I had documented and act on it without using the same processing chain that had already absorbed everything I had submitted. I thought about where such a person would be. I thought about the distance between me and such a person, measured in the terms of the siege network, the authority structure, the physical geography of the Vordrast campaign. I thought about what I had written in the personal log about the act of choosing. I held the log in my hand. The device was a standard-issue field notation unit, ruggedized, with an encrypted personal partition that only my biometric key could unlock. I made a decision. The decision was not the one I wanted to make. It was the one that was available. In the morning, I reported to Oris Tertium for the return to examination duties as instructed. Confessor Yrel acknowledged my presence with the same brief nod as always. The examination table was set up. The first group was forming outside. I took my position. Before the first subject entered, I sat for a moment with the notation armature in my hand, feeling the weight of the day's first blank form on the data slate. I thought about the soldiers in the forward sections. I thought about Trooper Ferron at the periscope aperture, utterly still under falling debris. I thought about Trooper Mast's heart rate during the wound packing change. I thought about the final prayers, delivered without inflection, into the indifferent air of the Medicae ward. I thought about whether the thing that was removing the interior process from these soldiers was also removing something from me, incrementally. Each time I had accepted a revision and filed a corrected form and confirmed a conclusion that matched the system's preferred output. I thought about the personal log in my pocket, with its 8 weeks of encrypted observations. The first subject entered and sat in the examination chair. I watched him fit the sensor pad to his forehead. I watched him hold out his arm for the blood sampling. I watched his eyes move to the wall behind the confessor, and I began to form the specific quality of attention I had developed for the examination work, the attention that listens past the words to the interval. Confessor Yrel began the catechism. The subject answered. Question 1. The correct answer. The interval between question and answer. I listened to the interval. I opened the notation armature. I began to write. On the 16th day after I returned to examination duties, Interrogator Scribe On returned to the examination block. She came during the afternoon examination session, between groups, when the tent was briefly empty of subjects. She came with one of the 2 audit functionaries from the internal review period and with a Medicae officer I had not previously encountered. She told me that a secondary procedure had been identified as necessary for operational continuity. She explained that during the internal audit review, some of my recorded observations had been identified as potentially indicative of cognitive strain associated with extended deployment in a high-intensity siege environment. She explained that this was a recognized condition and that its treatment was well established. She explained that the procedure was brief, conducted with full liturgical sanction, and was intended to preserve my operational effectiveness by correcting specific memory engrams that had become associated with non-productive interpretive patterns. She used the phrase mnemonic correction. She said it in the tone of a thing that is established, documented, and not currently being decided. The Medicae officer opened a case and removed equipment. It was familiar equipment. Some of the components were variants of the neural monitoring apparatus I used in my own examination work. I looked at Interrogator Scribe On. I said, I would like to know which memory engrams have been flagged. She told me. The flagged memories corresponded precisely to the observations I had been making. The 4 examinations at the beginning of this period, the field verification in the forward sections, the Medicae ward assessment, the Vox Echo incidents, the platoon advance and its timestamps, and the personal log. She said the personal log's contents had been reviewed during a secondary data access procedure conducted during the internal audit period. The encrypted partition, which required my biometric key to access, had been accessed by other means. I understood then that the timeline I had believed to exist, in which I had been performing a private documentation of anomalies while the official record showed nothing, was not the timeline that had actually existed. The private documentation had been accessible and had been accessed. The review had known its contents. The revision process had been performed with full knowledge of what I believed. The system had not been deceived. The system had processed everything, including what I thought was outside the system, and had classified it accordingly. I said, the timestamps. Interrogator Scribe On looked at me with the composed precision I had come to understand as the expression of someone who is not interested in the content of what is being said, only in the behavior of the person saying it. She said, "The timestamp discrepancy was attributable to Vox routing latency." I said, 2 minutes is outside the documented latency range. She said, "The documentation has been updated." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "And the soldiers, the ones from the forward sections, what happened to them?" She said, "They were assigned to suitable duties consistent with their evaluation profile." I said, "Are they still themselves?" This was not a question I should have asked. I knew it was not a question I should have asked. But I asked it, because I was still capable of asking it, because I had written 8 days ago in the personal log that the act of choosing remained present, and that as long as it remained, I was still distinct from what I had observed. Interrogator Scribe On looked at me for a moment that was different in quality from her previous attention, and I thought, briefly, that she was going to answer the question. That behind the precision, there was a person who had recognized the question as something other than a procedural deviation. Then she said, "The procedure will take approximately 40 minutes. You will experience minimal discomfort. Your examination duties will resume at the next scheduled session." The Medicae officer asked me to be seated in the examination chair. I was seated in the examination chair. The sensor pads placed on my forehead were the same type I used in my own examination work. The pressure of the headband fitting was familiar. The neural contact was a low, even warmth. Confessor Ural entered the room and took his standard position. This was the liturgical component. He opened his personal copy of the Lectitio Divinitatis, the worn one he carried always, and began to read. The words were a standard consecration of the procedure, the kind recited over any sanctioned medical intervention to affirm its service to the Emperor's will. The Medicae officer made an adjustment to the apparatus. I thought about what I had written in the personal log. I thought about the observation about choosing, about the interval that constitutes a person. I tried to hold it as something specific, something with texture and location, because I understood that the procedure would look for the engrams associated with non-productive interpretive patterns, and that these engrams would be the ones most closely associated with what I was currently thinking. I tried to remember the specific quality of Trooper Farron's stillness under the falling debris. I tried to remember Officer Rust's ward and the sound of the final prayers, delivered without inflection. I tried to remember what it had felt like to listen to the interval between question and answer, and to recognize the interval's absence as a loss. I tried to hold these as memories, as specific events with specific sensory content, because I knew that what was going to be removed was not the events themselves, but the web of association and interpretation that gave them significance. And if I could hold the raw events clearly enough, then perhaps the events themselves would remain. The confessor's voice continued. The apparatus became warmer. I do not know at what point in this process I lost the thread of what I was holding. I know that I am writing this, and that the act of writing this is the act of a person performing a function, and that the function is documentation, and that documentation is the substance of my service. I am at checkpoint Oris Tertium. I am performing the rotation examination for the current cycle. This is the third siege phase of the Vordrast compliance, and it is progressing according to regimental records in a manner consistent with established objectives. The examination procedure is standard. The confessor presides. I occupy the secondary station. The subjects present themselves in order. The catechism is administered. The subjects answer. Their vitals are within acceptable parameters. Their doctrinal responses are correct. Their biometric outputs align with their baseline profiles within the tolerances established for their rotation number and service history. I notate the results. I transfer the completed forms. The forms are clean. Each subject receives a clearance mark and proceeds to the exit. The system operates without interruption. Between sessions, I sit with my data slate and review the morning's completed records. The records are orderly. The entries are precise. The language is exact. Nothing requires amendment. I have 11,200 261 examinations in my record now, which is 18 more than at some earlier point I do not have clear access to. The gap in my consecutive session log for this deployment corresponds to what the official record categorizes as an administrative reassignment period. I have no personal notation from this period. The personal log contains entries from 8 weeks ago and then nothing until 3 days ago when I resumed notation. The 3 days of resumed notation are records of completed examination sessions with no supplementary observations. I do not find this unusual. The examination procedure has not changed. The catechism has not changed. The questions are the same questions. The answers are the same answers. Each subject sits, presents, answers, and is marked. I listen to the responses. They arrive at the correct speed. There is no unusual quality to the intervals. There is no absence I am waiting for and not finding. The interval between question and answer is the interval of a person answering a question they know the answer to. It is correct. I write the result in the appropriate field. The form moves to the next entry. Outside Auris Tertium, the artillery continues its day cycle. The ground moves. The tent breathes. The phosphor lantern in the corner pushes light across the examination table in slow arcs. I do not sit with the light particularly. It is light in a tent. It serves the function of a light. At the end of the first day's session, after the last group has been processed and cleared and Confessor Uriel has taken his position log and departed, I remain at the secondary station to complete the day's transfer submissions. The data streams receive the completed forms. The acknowledgement codes return. The records are committed. I open my personal log out of what feels like habit, the residue of a practice without clear origin in my current memory, and I sit with the blank entry field for a moment. I do not write anything. There is nothing I have observed today that requires supplementary notation. The subjects pass their examinations. The system is complete. I close the log. Outside, between the percussion of the distant batteries, there is a quality of silence that exists specifically in the gaps between sounds. I am aware of this silence as a feature of the environment in the same way I am aware of the light and the temperature and the particular smell of ash and chemical preservative that the examination tent retains from 6 months of continuous use. I do not sit with the silence particularly. I secure the data slate, disconnect the notation armature, and prepare to return to the billet for the rest period before the next rotation cycle begins. At the tent entrance I stop, because Trooper Ferrin is waiting for the following group's staging call, standing in the queue that has formed for tomorrow's early session. He is standing with 3 other soldiers. Their equipment is standard. Their posture is correct. I look at him. He does not look at me. I do not know why I stopped. There is nothing to observe here. His examination is scheduled for tomorrow. His record is accessible, current, and clean. The procedure will be standard. His results will be consistent with his prior assessments. I move past him and continue toward the billet. The queue does not shift. The soldiers stand. I do not look back. In the billet, before the rest period, I sit with my personal log open one more time. The entry field is empty. I am aware that it is empty in the way I am aware of the other features of the environment as a factual condition without particular weight. I consider whether there is anything to write. I do not find anything. I close the personal log. I lie on the billet board, and I do not sleep and I do not lie awake. And in the space between these states, which is the ordinary space of insufficient rest in a field environment, there is nothing that requires notation. The next rotation cycle begins in 4 hours. I will perform the examinations. The subjects will answer. The records will be clean.